Welcome, gentle listener, to a journey down the longest river in the world, a journey back in time to a civilization that endured for more than 3,000 years, a civilization that has captivated and enchanted the world for centuries. This is the story of ancient Egypt, a land of pharaohs and of pyramids, of gods and of goddesses, of mummies and of mysteries. It is a story of a civilization that rose from the fertile banks of the Nile River, a civilization that created a culture of extraordinary beauty, of profound wisdom, and of enduring power. In the northeast corner of Africa, surrounded by the vast and inhospitable deserts of the Sahara, lies a long and narrow strip of green, a ribbon of life that is nourished by the waters of the Nile River. This is the land of Egypt, a land that the ancient Greek historian Herodotus called the gift of the Nile. For it was the Nile that made life possible in this arid and unforgiving landscape, the Nile that provided the water for drinking and for irrigation, the Nile that deposited the rich and fertile silt that made the land so productive. The Nile was the source of all life in ancient Egypt, and it was the central and the defining feature of the Egyptian civilization for more than 3 millennia, from the unification of the kingdom around 3100 BC to its conquest by Alexander the Great in 332 BC. The civilization of ancient Egypt flourished. It was a civilization that was characterized by its remarkable stability and its continuity. A civilization that was able to maintain its unique and its distinctive culture for thousands of years. It was a civilization that was ruled by a series of powerful and divine kings, the pharaohs, who were seen as the intermediaries between the gods and the people. It was a civilization that built some of the most magnificent and the most enduring monuments in human history, the pyramids, the temples, and the tombs that still stand today as a testament to the skill, the ingenuity, and the ambition of the ancient Egyptians. In this sleepy history, we will explore the epic story of ancient Egypt, from the rise of the first pharaohs to the fall of the last queen, Cleopatra. We will journey through the 3 great kingdoms of Egyptian history: the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramid builders; the Middle Kingdom, the classical age of Egyptian literature and of art; and the New Kingdom, the age of empire and of conquest. We will meet some of the most famous and the most fascinating figures of Egyptian history: the boy king Tutankhamun, the powerful female pharaoh Hatshepsut, the great warrior king Ramesses II, and the enigmatic and the controversial heretic king Akhenaten. We will delve into the rich and the complex world of Egyptian religion, a world of gods and of goddesses, of myths and of legends, of magic and of ritual. We will explore the Egyptian belief in the afterlife, a belief that led them to develop the elaborate and the sophisticated practice of mummification, a practice that was designed to preserve the body for eternity. And we will marvel at the beauty and the sophistication of Egyptian art, of Egyptian architecture, and of Egyptian writing, the hieroglyphs, the sacred script that was for so long a mystery to the world. The story of ancient Egypt is a story of a civilization that was obsessed with life and with death, a civilization that sought to conquer mortality and to achieve a kind of immortality through its monuments, its art, and its religion. It is a story that is filled with moments of great splendor and of great mystery, a story that has inspired countless books, movies, and works of art. It is a story that continues to fascinate us, to inspire us, and to challenge us to this day. So, find a comfortable position, quiet your mind and let the gentle current of the Nile carry you back in time to a world of wonder and of enchantment. Let the story of ancient Egypt, a story of a civilization that was as timeless as the river that gave it life, lull you into a state of peaceful repose. Part 1. The Dawn of Civilization. The Predynastic Period and the Unification of Egypt. Long before the first pharaohs, long before the first pyramids, the story of ancient Egypt began in the fertile valley of the Nile River. The Predynastic Period, which lasted from around 6000 BC to 3100 BC, was a time of slow and steady development, a time when the foundations of Egyptian civilization were laid. It was a time when nomadic hunter-gatherers gradually settled down to become farmers, when small villages grew into larger towns, and when two distinct kingdoms emerged in the north and in the south of the land. The story of the Predynastic Period is the story of the birth of a civilization, a story that culminates in the unification of Egypt and the beginning of the dynastic age. The first Egyptians, from hunter-gatherers to farmers. The earliest inhabitants of the Nile Valley were nomadic hunter-gatherers who lived a simple and a precarious existence. They followed the herds of wild animals, they gathered wild plants, and they lived in small and temporary shelters. But around 6000 BC, a major climate change occurred. The Sahara, which had once been a lush and a fertile savanna, began to dry up and to turn into a desert. This climate change forced the people of the Sahara to migrate to the more hospitable environment of the Nile Valley, and it was this migration that led to the development of agriculture and to the beginning of a settled way of life. The first farmers of the Nile Valley cultivated wheat and barley, which they had domesticated from wild grasses. They also raised cattle, sheep, and goats. They lived in small villages of mud brick houses, and they developed a variety of new technologies, including pottery, weaving, and the use of stone tools. They also began to develop a more complex social and religious life. They buried their dead in simple graves, and they often included grave goods, such as pottery and jewelry, which suggests a belief in some form of afterlife. The two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt. Over time, the small villages of the Predynastic period grew into larger and more powerful towns. These towns became the centers of local and of regional power, and they were often in conflict with each other. By around 3500 BC, two distinct kingdoms had emerged in the Nile Valley. Lower Egypt in the north, in the fertile delta of the Nile, and Upper Egypt in the south, in the long and narrow valley of the river. Lower Egypt was a land of marshes and of wetlands, a land that was rich in agricultural resources. The people of Lower Egypt were known for their distinctive red pottery and for their worship of the cobra goddess, Wadjet. The king of Lower Egypt wore a red crown, the deshret, and the symbol of his kingdom was the papyrus plant. Upper Egypt was a land of cliffs and of deserts, a land that was more arid and more rugged than Lower Egypt. The people of Upper Egypt were known for their distinctive black-topped pottery and for their worship of the vulture goddess Nekhbet. The king of Upper Egypt wore a white crown, the hedjet, and the symbol of his kingdom was the lotus flower. The two kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt were often in conflict with each other, but they also had a great deal of contact and of cultural exchange. They traded with each other, they intermarried, and they shared many of the same religious beliefs and of the same cultural practices. They were two parts of a single whole, two lands that were destined to be united. The unification of Egypt. The first pharaoh. The unification of Egypt is one of the most important and the most mysterious events in Egyptian history. It is an event that is shrouded in myth and in legend, an event that is difficult to reconstruct from the available archaeological and historical evidence. According to Egyptian tradition, the unification of Egypt was the work of a great and a heroic king named Menes, who came from the south and who conquered the north. Menes is said to have founded the city of Memphis, which became the capital of the newly unified kingdom, and he is said to have been the first pharaoh of the first dynasty. The identity of Menes is a matter of much debate among scholars. Some believe that he was a real historical figure, while others believe that he was a legendary figure who was created to symbolize the unification of the two lands. The archaeological evidence suggests that the unification of Egypt was a long and a gradual process, a process that may have taken several generations. The most important piece of evidence for the unification of Egypt is the Narmer palette, a beautifully carved stone palette that was discovered at the ancient site of Hierakonpolis. The Narmer palette depicts a king named Narmer, who is shown wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. This has led many scholars to believe that Narmer was the king who was responsible for the unification of Egypt, and that he may have been the same person as the legendary Menes. Whatever the exact circumstances of the unification, the creation of a single, unified kingdom was a momentous event. It marked the beginning of the dynastic age, the beginning of a period of more than 3,000 years in which Egypt would be ruled by a series of powerful and divine kings. The unification of Egypt was the culmination of the long and the slow process of development that had begun in the predynastic period, and it was the foundation upon which the great and the enduring civilization of ancient Egypt was built. Part 2. The Old Kingdom, the Age of the Pyramid Builders. The Old Kingdom, which lasted from around 2686 BC to 2181 BC, was the first great golden age of Egyptian civilization. It was a time of peace and of prosperity, a time of great artistic and of architectural achievement, a time when the power of the pharaoh was absolute and when the foundations of Egyptian society were firmly established. The Old Kingdom is most famous for its magnificent and its enduring monuments, the pyramids, the great tombs of the pharaohs that still stand today as a testament to the power, the ambition, and the ingenuity of the ancient Egyptians. The Divine King, the Pharaoh and the State. At the heart of the Old Kingdom was the institution of the divine kingship. The Pharaoh was not just a king. He was a god on earth, the living embodiment of the falcon god, Horus. He was the intermediary between the gods and the people, the one who was responsible for maintaining the cosmic order, or Ma'at. Ma'at was the concept of truth, of justice, and of harmony, and it was the central and the guiding principle of Egyptian civilization. The pharaoh was the one who was responsible for ensuring that Ma'at was upheld, and he did so by performing the sacred rituals, by building the temples, and by defending the borders of Egypt against its enemies. The power of the pharaoh was absolute. He was the owner of all the land in Egypt, the commander-in-chief of the army, and the supreme judge of the land. He was assisted in his duties by a large and a complex bureaucracy, which was headed by the vizier, the pharaoh's chief minister. The vizier was the most powerful official in the kingdom, and he was responsible for the day-to-day administration of the state. The Old Kingdom was a highly centralized and a bureaucratic state, a state that was able to mobilize the vast resources of the kingdom to achieve its goals. The Pyramid Builders, monuments to eternity. The most famous and the most enduring achievement of the Old Kingdom was the construction of the pyramids. The pyramids were not just tombs. They were monuments to the divine power of the pharaohs, machines of resurrection that were designed to ensure the pharaoh's successful journey to the afterlife. The pyramids were the culmination of a long tradition of royal tomb building, a tradition that had begun in the predynastic period with the simple pit graves, and that had evolved into the more elaborate mastaba tombs of the early dynastic period. The first pyramid was built by the pharaoh Djoser, who ruled during the Third Dynasty. Djoser's pyramid, which is located at the site of Saqqara, was a step pyramid, a series of 6 mastabas of decreasing size that were stacked one on top of the other. The step pyramid was a revolutionary innovation, the first large-scale stone building in the world, and it was a testament to the genius of its architect, the great vizier and high priest, Imhotep. The true pyramid, with its smooth and sloping sides, was developed during the Fourth Dynasty. The most famous and the most magnificent of the true pyramids are the 3 great pyramids at Giza, which were built by the pharaohs Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is the largest and the most impressive of the 3, and it was the tallest man-made structure in the world for more than 3,800 years. The construction of the pyramids was a massive undertaking, a project that required a huge amount of labor, of resources, and of organizational skill. The pyramids were built by a workforce of skilled laborers who were conscripted from all over Egypt and who were housed and fed by the state. The construction of the pyramids was a testament to the power and the wealth of the Old Kingdom, and it was a project that united the entire nation in a common purpose. The decline of the Old Kingdom. The First Intermediate Period. The Old Kingdom was a period of great stability and of great achievement, but it was not to last forever. By the end of the Sixth Dynasty, the power of the pharaohs had begun to decline. The construction of the pyramids had placed a huge strain on the resources of the kingdom, and the power of the central government was being challenged by the growing power of the provincial governors, or nomarchs. A series of low Nile floods also contributed to the decline of the Old Kingdom, leading to famine and to social unrest. Around 2181 BC, the Old Kingdom collapsed, and Egypt entered a period of disunity and of civil war known as the First Intermediate Period. The First Intermediate Period was a time of chaos and of confusion, a time when the authority of the pharaoh was no longer recognized, and when the land was divided into a series of small and competing kingdoms. The First Intermediate Period was a dark and a difficult time for the people of Egypt, but it was also a time of great creativity and of great change. It was a time when new ideas and new forms of expression emerged, a time that would ultimately pave the way for the reunification of Egypt and the beginning of a new golden age, the Middle Kingdom. Part 3. The Middle Kingdom, the Classical Age. After a century of chaos and of civil war, Egypt was once again united under the rule of a single pharaoh. The Middle Kingdom, which lasted from around 2055 BC to 1650 BC, was a period of renewed stability and of prosperity, a time when the traditions of the Old Kingdom were revived, and when new and innovative forms of art, of literature, and of religion emerged. The Middle Kingdom is often referred to as the classical age of Egyptian civilization, a time when the culture of ancient Egypt reached a new level of sophistication and of refinement. The reunification of Egypt. The Theban kings. The reunification of Egypt was the work of a series of powerful and ambitious kings from the southern city of Thebes. The Theban kings, who made up the 11th and the 12th dynasties, gradually extended their power to the north and they eventually succeeded in defeating their rivals and in reuniting the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt. The first king of the Middle Kingdom was Mentuhotep II, who is depicted in Egyptian art as a great warrior and as a unifier of the nation. The kings of the Middle Kingdom were not the absolute and the divine rulers that the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom had been. They were more like shepherds of their people, rulers who were concerned with the welfare of their subjects and who sought to promote justice and to ensure the prosperity of the land. The literature of the Middle Kingdom is filled with stories and with instructions that emphasize the importance of good governance and of social responsibility. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom were also great builders, but they did not build on the same massive scale as the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom. They built smaller and more modest pyramids, and they also built a series of fortresses in Nubia, the land to the south of Egypt, to protect the southern border of the kingdom and to control the trade in gold and in other valuable resources. The golden age of literature and of art, the Middle Kingdom, was a golden age of Egyptian literature. It was a time when a new and a more expressive form of the Egyptian language, Middle Egyptian, became the standard for literary texts. The literature of the Middle Kingdom is characterized by its sophistication, its psychological depth, and its wide range of genres. It includes stories, poems, instructions, and philosophical texts. Some of the most famous works of Egyptian literature, such as the story of Sinuhe and the tale of the eloquent peasant, were written during the Middle Kingdom. The art of the Middle Kingdom was also characterized by a new and a more naturalistic style. The stiff and the formal style of the Old Kingdom was replaced by a more realistic and a more expressive style, a style that sought to capture the individuality and the humanity of the subject. The statues of the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom are often depicted with careworn and with world-weary expressions, a far cry from the serene and the godlike expressions of the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom. The rise of Osiris, a new vision of the afterlife. The Middle Kingdom also saw a major change in the religious beliefs of the ancient Egyptians. The cult of the sun god Ra, which had been the dominant cult of the Old Kingdom, was gradually replaced by the cult of the god Osiris. Osiris was the god of the underworld, the god of death and of resurrection. According to Egyptian mythology, Osiris was a good and a just king who was murdered by his jealous brother, Seth. He was brought back to life by his devoted wife, Isis, and he became the ruler of the underworld and the judge of the dead. The rise of the cult of Osiris was a reflection of a new and a more democratic vision of the afterlife. In the Old Kingdom, the afterlife was seen as the exclusive preserve of the pharaoh. But in the Middle Kingdom, the afterlife became available to all who could afford the proper burial and the proper rituals. The coffin texts, which were a collection of magical spells that were written on the inside of coffins, were designed to help the deceased to navigate the dangers of the underworld and to achieve a happy and a prosperous afterlife. The rise of the cult of Osiris was a major development in the history of Egyptian religion, and it was a development that would have a profound and a lasting impact on the culture of ancient Egypt. The invasion of the Hyksos, the Second Intermediate Period. The Middle Kingdom was a period of great stability and of great achievement, but it was not to last forever. By the end of the 13th dynasty, the power of the pharaohs had once again begun to decline. The kingdom was weakened by a series of short and ineffective reigns, and it was also threatened by the arrival of a new and a foreign people, the Hyksos. The Hyksos were a Semitic people from the Near East who had gradually migrated into the eastern delta of the Nile. They were a warlike people, and they had superior military technology, including the horse-drawn chariot and the composite bow. Around 1650 BC, the Hyksos took control of Lower Egypt, and they established their own dynasty of kings. The Hyksos invasion marked the end of the Middle Kingdom and the beginning of a new period of disunity and of foreign rule, the Second Intermediate Period. The Second Intermediate Period was a time of humiliation and of shame for the people of Egypt, but it was also a time of great technological and of cultural exchange. The Egyptians learned the new military technologies of the Hyksos, and they would use these new technologies to drive the Hyksos out of Egypt and to create a new and a more powerful empire, the New Kingdom. Part 4. The New Kingdom, the Age of Empire. After a century of foreign rule, the Egyptians rose up against their Hyksos overlords and drove them out of Egypt. The expulsion of the Hyksos marked the beginning of the New Kingdom, which lasted from around 1550 BC to 1070 BC. The New Kingdom was the most glorious and the most prosperous period in Egyptian history, a time when Egypt was a great and a powerful empire, a time when the pharaohs ruled over a vast and a wealthy domain that stretched from the Euphrates River in the north to the fourth cataract of the Nile in the south. The New Kingdom was an age of conquest and of empire, an age of great wealth and of great power, an age of magnificent art and of monumental architecture. The warrior pharaohs, the birth of an empire. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom were a new breed of king. They were not the remote and the godlike rulers of the Old Kingdom, nor were they the benevolent shepherds of the Middle Kingdom. They were warrior pharaohs, military leaders who were determined to expand the borders of Egypt and to create a vast and a powerful empire. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom learned the lessons of the Second Intermediate Period, and they were determined to never again allow Egypt to be invaded and to be humiliated by a foreign power. They created a large and a professional army, an army that was equipped with the latest military technology, including the horse-drawn chariot and the composite bow. And they used this army to conquer a vast and a wealthy empire in the Near East and in Nubia. The founder of the New Kingdom was Ahmose I, the king who drove the Hyksos out of Egypt and who reunited the two lands. He was followed by a series of great and a powerful warrior pharaohs, including Thutmose I, who was the first pharaoh to be buried in the Valley of the Kings, Thutmose III, who was one of the greatest military leaders in Egyptian history, and who is often called the Napoleon of Egypt, and Amenhotep III, who ruled over a vast and a wealthy empire at the height of its power and of its glory. The Great Queen, Hatshepsut. One of the most remarkable and the most fascinating figures of the New Kingdom was Hatshepsut, a woman who ruled as a pharaoh for more than 20 years. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I and the wife of Thutmose II. When her husband died, she became the regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III. But Hatshepsut was not content to be a regent. She was a woman of great ambition and of great ability, and she soon declared herself to be the pharaoh. She ruled as a man, and she was often depicted in Egyptian art with the traditional male attributes of the pharaoh, including a false beard. Hatshepsut was a great builder, and she was responsible for the construction of some of the most magnificent and the most beautiful monuments of the New Kingdom, including her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. The heretic king, Akhenaten. Another remarkable and controversial figure of the New Kingdom was Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king. Akhenaten abandoned the traditional polytheistic religion of Egypt and introduced a new and a radical monotheistic religion, the worship of the sun disk, the Aten. He closed the temples of the old gods. He moved the capital of Egypt to a new and a purpose-built city, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, and he changed his own name from Amenhotep IV to Akhenaten, which means the servant of the Aten. The Amarna period, as the reign of Akhenaten is known, was a time of great artistic and of religious innovation. The art of the Amarna period is characterized by a new and a more naturalistic style, a style that is often described as expressionistic. But Akhenaten's religious revolution was not popular with the people of Egypt, and it was fiercely opposed by the powerful and the wealthy priesthood of the old gods. After Akhenaten's death, his religious reforms were abandoned, his new capital was deserted, and his name was erased from the historical records. The Golden Age of Ramesses the Great. The New Kingdom reached its final and its most glorious peak during the long and the prosperous reign of Ramesses II, who is often called Ramesses the Great. Ramesses II was a great warrior, a great builder, and a great propagandist. He fought a series of wars against the Hittites, the other great power of the Near East, and he signed the world's first recorded peace treaty with them. He was also a prolific builder, and he was responsible for the construction of some of the most magnificent and the most impressive monuments of the New Kingdom, including the Great Temple at Abu Simbel and the Ramesseum, his mortuary temple at Thebes. Ramesses II ruled for more than 60 years, and he left a deep and a lasting mark on the history and the culture of ancient Egypt. The decline of the New Kingdom, the Third Intermediate Period. The New Kingdom was a period of great power and of great glory, but it was not to last forever. By the end of the 20th dynasty, the power of the pharaohs had once again begun to decline. The kingdom was weakened by a series of internal struggles, by the growing power of the priesthood of Amun-Ra, and by the loss of its empire in the Near East. The New Kingdom was also threatened by a new and a powerful enemy, the Sea Peoples, a mysterious confederation of seafaring peoples who were ravaging the eastern Mediterranean. Around 1070 BC, the New Kingdom collapsed, and Egypt entered a new period of disunity and of foreign rule, the Third Intermediate Period. The Third Intermediate Period was a long and a complex period, a time when Egypt was ruled by a series of foreign dynasties, including the Libyans and the Nubians. It was a time of decline and of fragmentation, a time that marked the beginning of the end for the great and the enduring civilization of ancient Egypt. Part 5. The Late Period. The Twilight of a Civilization. The Third Intermediate Period was a time of decline and of fragmentation, but it was not the end of Egyptian civilization. The Late Period, which lasted from around 664 BC to 332 BC, was a time of brief and of flickering revivals, a time when Egypt was able to regain its independence and to reassert its cultural identity. But it was also a time of increasing foreign domination, a time when Egypt was conquered by a series of powerful and of ambitious empires, including the Assyrians, the Persians, and finally the Greeks. The Late Period was the twilight of a great civilization, a long and a slow decline that would ultimately lead to the end of more than 3,000 years of pharaonic rule. The Saite Revival, a brief renaissance. The Late Period began with a brief and a brilliant renaissance under the rule of the Saite kings of the 26th dynasty. The Saite kings, who came from the city of Sais in the Nile Delta, were able to drive the Assyrians out of Egypt and to reunite the country under their rule. They were great admirers of the Old Kingdom, and they sought to revive the art, the architecture, and the literature of that golden age. The art of the Saite period is characterized by its archaism, its deliberate and its self-conscious imitation of the style of the Old Kingdom. The Scythe kings were also great traders, and they established close commercial and cultural ties with the Greeks and with other peoples of the Mediterranean. The Persian conquest. A new master, the Scythe revival, was not to last. In 525 BC, Egypt was conquered by the Persians, who were building a vast and a powerful empire in the Near East. The Persian conquest was a major turning point in Egyptian history. For the first time, Egypt was ruled by a foreign power that was not assimilated into the Egyptian culture. The Persian kings ruled Egypt as a satrapy or province of their empire, and they were often seen as oppressive and as tyrannical rulers. The Egyptians resented the Persian rule, and they launched a series of rebellions against their foreign masters. But the Persians were too powerful, and they were able to maintain their control over Egypt for more than a century. The last native pharaohs, a final flicker of independence. In the late 5th and early 4th centuries BC, Egypt was able to regain its independence for a brief and a final time. A series of native Egyptian kings who made up the 28th, the 29th, and the 30th dynasties were able to drive the Persians out of Egypt and to restore pharaonic rule. The most famous of these last native pharaohs was Nectanebo II, who was a great builder and a great patron of the arts. But the independence of Egypt was precarious, and it was constantly threatened by the growing power of the Persian Empire. In 343 BC, the Persians reconquered Egypt, and the last native pharaoh, Nectanebo II, was forced to flee to Nubia. The age of the pharaohs was coming to an end. The arrival of Alexander the Great, a new era. In 332 BC, a new and a powerful conqueror appeared on the scene. Alexander the Great. Alexander was the king of Macedon, a small and a mountainous kingdom to the north of Greece. He was a military genius, and he was determined to conquer the vast and the wealthy Persian Empire. When Alexander arrived in Egypt, he was welcomed as a liberator. The Egyptians were tired of the oppressive rule of the Persians, and they saw Alexander as a savior. Alexander was crowned as a pharaoh in the city of Memphis, and he founded a new and a magnificent city on the Mediterranean coast, the city of Alexandria, which would become the new capital of Egypt and one of the greatest centers of learning and of culture in the ancient world. The Ptolemaic dynasty. The last pharaohs. After the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, his vast empire was divided among his generals. Egypt fell to the control of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted and most able commanders. Ptolemy declared himself to be the king of Egypt, and he founded a new dynasty of rulers, the Ptolemaic dynasty, which would rule Egypt for the next 300 years. The Ptolemaic kings were of Greek descent, but they ruled as pharaohs, and they adopted the traditional religious and cultural practices of the ancient Egyptians. They were great patrons of the arts and of the sciences, and they made Alexandria into a great and a vibrant center of Hellenistic culture. Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt. The last of the Ptolemaic rulers was Cleopatra VII, one of the most famous and the most fascinating women in history. Cleopatra was a woman of great intelligence, of great ambition, and of great charm. She was a skilled politician and a shrewd diplomat, and she was determined to preserve the independence of her kingdom in a world that was increasingly dominated by the growing power of Rome. She formed alliances with two of the most powerful men in Rome, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and she bore children to both of them. But her alliance with Mark Antony brought her into conflict with his rival, Octavian, who would later become the Emperor Augustus. In 31 BC, the forces of Antony and Cleopatra were defeated by the forces of Octavian at the Battle of Actium. The following year, Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide, and Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. The death of Cleopatra marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the end of pharaonic rule, and the end of the great and the enduring civilization of ancient Egypt. Part 6. The World of the Gods. Egyptian Religion and Mythology. Religion was the very heart of ancient Egyptian civilization, a pervasive and all-encompassing force that shaped every aspect of life, from the grand rituals of the state to the simple and personal beliefs of the individual. The Egyptian worldview was a complex and a beautiful tapestry woven from myth, from magic, and from a deep and an abiding reverence for the natural world. It was a world inhabited by a vast and a bewildering pantheon of gods and of goddesses. A world where the boundaries between the human and the divine were fluid and permeable. A world where the eternal cycle of life, of death, and of rebirth was the central and the guiding principle. A universe of order and of chaos. The Egyptian cosmos was a world of duality, a world that was defined by the constant struggle between order and chaos. The forces of order, which were known as Ma'at, were represented by the sun, by the Nile, and by the predictable and the life-giving rhythms of the natural world. The forces of chaos, which were known as Isfet, were represented by the desert, by the darkness, and by the unpredictable and the destructive forces of nature. The primary duty of the pharaoh, and of every individual, was to uphold Ma'at and to defend the world against the forces of Isfet, the pantheon of the gods, a divine family. The Egyptian pantheon was a vast and a complex one, with hundreds of different gods and of goddesses, each with its own specific domain and its own particular set of myths and of rituals. The gods were not remote and transcendent beings, but were active and engaged participants in the life of the world. They were often depicted in a hybrid form, with a human body and the head of an animal, a form that was meant to symbolize their specific attributes and their connection to the natural world. Some of the most important gods and goddesses of the Egyptian pantheon included Ra, or Re, the sun god, the creator of the world, and the king of the gods. He was the most important god of the Old Kingdom, and he was often depicted as a man with the head of a falcon, crowned with the sun disk, Osiris, the god of the underworld, the god of death and of resurrection. He was a benevolent and a just king who was murdered by his jealous brother Seth, and who was brought back to life by his devoted wife, Isis. He became the ruler of the underworld and the judge of the dead. Isis, the wife of Osiris and the mother of Horus. She was a powerful and a benevolent goddess, a magician who was able to bring her husband back to life. She was the ideal wife and mother, and she was a symbol of love, of devotion, and of compassion. Horus, the son of Osiris and of Isis. He was the falcon god, the god of the sky, and the protector of the pharaoh. He avenged the death of his father by defeating his uncle Seth, and he became the rightful heir to the throne of Egypt. The living pharaoh was seen as the earthly embodiment of Horus. Seth, the brother of Osiris and the god of chaos, of violence, and of the desert. He was a powerful and a dangerous god, a trickster who was responsible for the death of his brother. But he was also a necessary and an important part of the cosmic order, a force of destruction that was necessary for the process of creation and of rebirth. Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification and of the afterlife. He was the one who guided the souls of the dead through the underworld and who weighed their hearts in the final judgment. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, of writing, and of knowledge. He was the scribe of the gods, the one who was responsible for recording the events of the world and for maintaining the cosmic order. Myths and legends. Stories of the gods. The Egyptians had a rich and a complex mythology, a collection of stories and of legends that explained the origins of the world, the nature of the gods, and the relationship between the human and the divine. The most important of these myths was the myth of Osiris, a story of death and of resurrection that was at the heart of the Egyptian belief in the afterlife. The myth of Osiris was a powerful and a moving story, a story that provided a model for the human experience of life, of death, and of rebirth. Temples and festivals. The worship of the gods. The Egyptians worshipped their gods in great and magnificent temples, which were seen as the homes of the gods on earth. The temples were not places of public worship, but were sacred and exclusive spaces, accessible only to the priests and to the pharaoh. The temples were the centers of the Egyptian economy, and they owned vast tracts of land and employed thousands of people. The daily life of the temple was governed by a complex and an elaborate series of rituals, which were designed to honor the gods and to ensure the continued stability of the world. The Egyptians also celebrated a series of great religious festivals throughout the year. These festivals were a time of great joy and of great celebration, a time when the statues of the gods were carried out of the temples in great processions and when the people could participate in the worship of the gods. The most important of these festivals was the Opet festival, a great celebration that was held in Thebes and that was dedicated to the god Amun-Ra. Egyptian religion was a rich and a complex system, a system that was at once deeply spiritual and intensely practical. It was a system that provided a sense of meaning and of purpose to the lives of the ancient Egyptians, a system that helped them to understand their place in the world and to cope with the great mysteries of life and of death. Part 7. The Journey to Eternity. Mummification and the Afterlife. Of all the fascinating aspects of ancient Egyptian civilization, none has captured the modern imagination more than their elaborate beliefs about the afterlife and their sophisticated practice of mummification. The Egyptians had a deep and an abiding faith in the continuation of life after death, a belief that the end of life on earth was not the end of existence, but merely a transition to another, more perfect and eternal realm. This belief was the driving force behind their complex funeral rituals, their magnificent tombs, and their extraordinary efforts to preserve the human body for eternity. The Egyptian soul, a complex entity. The Egyptian concept of the soul was a complex one. They believed that the human personality was made up of several different parts, each of which had a specific function and a specific destiny after death. The most important of these were the Ka and the Ba. The Ka was the life force, the spiritual double of the individual. It was created at the moment of birth, and it was the part of the soul that needed to be sustained with food and with drink after death. The offerings that were placed in the tomb were meant for the Ka, and the false door that was a common feature of Egyptian tombs was a magical doorway through which the Ka could pass to receive these offerings. The Ba was the personality of the individual, the part of the soul that made each person unique. It was often depicted as a bird with a human head, and it was the part of the soul that could travel between the tomb and the underworld. The Ba was the part of the soul that was responsible for the individual's mobility and for their ability to interact with the world of the living. For the deceased to achieve a successful afterlife, it was essential that the Ka and the Ba be reunited after death. This reunion could only take place if the physical body was preserved, and it was this belief that led the Egyptians to develop the practice of mummification. Mummification, the art of preservation. Mummification was a long and a complex process. A process that took 70 days, and that was performed by a special class of priests who were skilled in the art of embalming. The goal of mummification was to dehydrate the body and to prevent it from decomposing. The process began with the removal of the internal organs, which were the first to decay. The brain was removed through the nose with a long, hooked instrument. The other organs, including the liver, the lungs, the stomach, and the intestines, were removed through an incision in the left side of the body. The heart, which was believed to be the seat of intelligence and of emotion, was left in place. The removed organs were then dried and were placed in a series of 4 special jars, known as canopic jars, which were dedicated to the 4 sons of Horus. The body was then packed with natron, a natural salt that was found in the deserts of Egypt, and it was left to dry for 40 days. After the body was completely dehydrated, it was cleaned and was anointed with oils and with resins. It was then wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen bandages, a process that could take up to 15 days. Amulets and magical charms were often placed between the layers of the bandages to protect the deceased on their journey to the afterlife. The tomb, a house for eternity. The tomb was seen as the house of the deceased for eternity, and it was designed to provide for all of their needs in the afterlife. The tombs of the wealthy were often decorated with beautiful and intricate paintings and reliefs that depicted scenes from the life of the deceased, as well as scenes from the afterlife. These scenes were not just decorative, they were magical, and they were meant to ensure that the deceased would be able to enjoy all of the pleasures of life in the world to come. The tomb was also filled with a variety of grave goods, including furniture, clothing, jewelry, and food. The tomb of the boy king, Tutankhamun, which was discovered in 1922, was filled with a staggering array of treasures, a testament to the wealth and the power of the New Kingdom pharaohs. The grave goods were meant to provide for the physical needs of the deceased in the afterlife, and they were also a symbol of their status and of their wealth. The final judgment, the weighing of the heart. Before the deceased could enter the paradise of the afterlife, they had to pass a final judgment. This judgment, which is depicted in the Book of the Dead, took place in the Hall of Two Truths, where the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and of justice. The deceased had to recite a series of negative confessions, in which they denied having committed a variety of sins. If the heart was lighter than the feather, it meant that the deceased had lived a good and a virtuous life, and they were allowed to enter the afterlife. But if the heart was heavier than the feather, it meant that the deceased had lived a life of sin, and their heart was devoured by a monstrous creature called Ammit, the devourer of the dead. This was the second and final death, the end of existence. The Egyptian belief in the afterlife was a powerful and a complex one, a belief that was at the very heart of their civilization. It was a belief that inspired them to create some of the most magnificent and the most enduring monuments in human history, a belief that gave them a sense of hope and of purpose in the face of the great and the universal mystery of death. Part 8. The Book of the Dead, a guide to the afterlife. For the ancient Egyptians, the journey to the afterlife was a perilous and a complex one, a journey that was fraught with dangers and with obstacles. To navigate this treacherous path, the deceased needed a guide, a map, a collection of magical spells and of incantations that would help them to overcome the challenges of the underworld and to achieve a happy and a prosperous afterlife. This guide was the Book of the Dead, one of the most famous and the most important religious texts of ancient Egypt. A collection of spells and of incantations, the Book of the Dead is not a single book, but a collection of some 200 different spells and incantations that were written on papyrus scrolls and that were placed in the tomb with the deceased. The spells were designed to provide the deceased with the magical knowledge and the power that they would need to navigate the underworld, to overcome the various demons and monsters that they would encounter, and to pass the final judgment. The spells were often accompanied by beautiful and intricate illustrations, or vignettes, that depicted the various stages of the journey to the afterlife. The Book of the Dead was not a standardized text, and no two copies are exactly alike. Each individual could choose the spells that they wanted to include in their own personal copy, and the selection of spells would often depend on the wealth and the status of the deceased. The wealthy could afford to have a beautifully illustrated and a comprehensive copy of the Book of the Dead, while the poor might have to make do with a few simple spells written on a small piece of papyrus. The Journey Through the Underworld. The Book of the Dead provides a detailed and a vivid account of the journey through the underworld, or the Duat. The Duat was a complex and a dangerous place, a world of darkness and of fire, a world that was inhabited by a host of strange and terrifying creatures. The deceased had to pass through a series of gates, each of which was guarded by a fearsome demon. To pass through the gates, the deceased had to know the name of the demon and to recite the correct magical spell. The Book of the Dead also contains spells that were designed to protect the deceased from the various dangers of the underworld, such as the Lake of Fire, the Serpent Apep, and the Devourer of the Dead. There were spells that allowed the deceased to transform themselves into different animals, spells that allowed them to breathe and to eat and to drink in the underworld, and spells that allowed them to be reunited with their family and with their loved ones. The Weighing of the Heart. The most famous and the most important part of the Book of the Dead is the spell for the weighing of the heart, which is often depicted in the accompanying vignettes. This spell describes the final judgment of the deceased, which took place in the Hall of Two Truths. The heart of the deceased was weighed on a great balance against the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth and of justice. The god Anubis was responsible for the weighing, and the god Thoth was responsible for recording the result. During the weighing, the deceased had to recite the negative confession, a list of some 42 sins that they had not committed. The negative confession was a kind of moral code, a guide to the ethical and the social values of ancient Egypt. It included a variety of different sins, from murder and theft to lying and to causing pain to others. If the heart of the deceased was found to be lighter than the feather of Maat, it meant that they had lived a good and a virtuous life, and they were declared to be true of voice. They were then led by the god Horus into the presence of Osiris, the king of the underworld, and they were allowed to enter the paradise of the afterlife, the Field of Reeds. The Field of Reeds was a beautiful and a fertile land, a place where the deceased could live for eternity in a state of happiness and of abundance. But if the heart of the deceased was found to be heavier than the feather of Maat, it meant that they had lived a life of sin, and they were condemned to a second and a final death. Their heart was devoured by the monstrous creature Amit, the devourer of the dead, a terrifying beast that was part crocodile, part lion, and part hippopotamus. The deceased was then cast into the darkness, to be tormented for eternity. A guide to a good life. The Book of the Dead was more than just a guide to the afterlife. It was also a guide to a good life. The negative confession, with its emphasis on truth, on justice, and on compassion, provided a moral and an ethical framework for the people of ancient Egypt. It taught them that their actions in this life would have consequences in the next, and it encouraged them to live a life of virtue and of integrity. The Book of the Dead was a powerful and a profound text, a text that reveals the deep and the abiding faith of the ancient Egyptians in the power of magic, in the importance of morality, and in the promise of eternal life. Part 9. The People of the Nile, Society and Daily Life in Ancient Egypt. While the grand monuments and the powerful pharaohs often dominate our view of ancient Egypt, the civilization was, at its heart, a society of ordinary people. The daily lives of the farmers, the artisans, the scribes, and the women who made up the vast majority of the population were a world away from the splendor of the royal court. Yet, it was their labor, their beliefs, and their social structures that formed the very foundation of this enduring civilization. Egyptian society was a highly stratified pyramid, but it was also a world of vibrant communities, of strong family bonds, and of a deep connection to the rhythms of the Nile. The social pyramid. A place for everyone. Egyptian society was structured like a pyramid, with the pharaoh at the very top and the great mass of the common people at the bottom. It was a world of clear and rigid social distinctions, a world in which everyone had a specific place and a specific role to play. The pharaoh. At the apex of society was the pharaoh, the divine king who was the absolute ruler of the land. He was the intermediary between the gods and the people, the one who was responsible for maintaining order and for ensuring the prosperity of the kingdom. The vizier and the high officials. Below the pharaoh was a small and a powerful elite of high officials who were responsible for the administration of the state. The most important of these was the vizier, the pharaoh's chief minister, who was the head of the bureaucracy and the supreme judge of the land. The priests and the scribes. The priests were a powerful and a wealthy class who were responsible for the worship of the gods and for the maintenance of the temples. The scribes were the educated elite of Egyptian society, the men who were able to read and to write the complex hieroglyphic script. They were the bureaucrats, the administrators, and the record keepers of the kingdom. The artisans and the craftsmen. The artisans and the craftsmen were a skilled and a respected class who were responsible for the construction of the temples and the tombs, and for the creation of the beautiful and the sophisticated art of ancient Egypt. They included stonemasons, carpenters, painters, and jewelers. The farmers. The farmers made up the vast majority of the population, and they were the backbone of the Egyptian economy. They worked the land, they grew the crops, and they paid the taxes that supported the state. Their lives were governed by the annual cycle of the Nile, the inundation, the growing season, and the harvest. The slaves. At the very bottom of the social pyramid were the slaves. Slavery in ancient Egypt was different from the chattel slavery of the classical world. Slaves were usually prisoners of war or criminals, and they had certain rights. They could own property, they could marry, and they could even be adopted into a family. Family life. The heart of society. The family was the fundamental unit of Egyptian society. The Egyptians had a deep and an abiding respect for the family, and they placed a high value on marriage and on children. Marriage was a social and an economic arrangement, and it was usually arranged by the parents of the bride and of the groom. The husband was the head of the family, but the wife had a great deal of independence and of legal rights. She could own property, she could run a business, and she could inherit and bequeath property. Children were seen as a blessing, and they were the center of family life. They were raised by their mothers and by their nurses, and they were taught the skills and the values that they would need to become productive members of society. Boys from the upper classes would often go to school to become scribes, while boys from the lower classes would learn the trade of their fathers. Girls were generally educated at home, where they were taught the skills of running a household, daily life, a world of work and of play. The daily life of the ancient Egyptians was a world of work and of play. The farmers worked in the fields, the artisans worked in their workshops, and the scribes worked in the government offices. But the Egyptians also knew how to enjoy themselves. They loved music and dancing, and they played a variety of different games, including a board game called Senet. They also enjoyed hunting and fishing in the marshes of the Nile, and they loved to tell stories and to listen to poetry. The diet of the ancient Egyptians was simple but healthy. The staple foods were bread and beer, which were made from the wheat and the barley that were grown in the fields. They also ate a variety of different vegetables, including onions, garlic, and lettuce, and a variety of different fruits, including dates, figs, and pomegranates. Fish was an important source of protein, and the wealthy could also afford to eat meat, such as beef, mutton, and poultry. The Egyptians were a clean and a well-groomed people. They bathed regularly in the Nile, and they used a variety of different cosmetics, including eye paint and lipstick. They wore simple and elegant clothes that were made of linen, and they adorned themselves with a variety of different jewelry, including necklaces, bracelets, and earrings. The daily life of the ancient Egyptians was a world of order and of routine, a world that was governed by the rhythms of the Nile and by the cycles of the sun. It was a world that was at once deeply religious and intensely practical, a world that was filled with a love of life and with a deep and an abiding faith in the promise of eternity. Part 10. The Sacred Script, Hieroglyphs, and the Rosetta Stone. One of the most distinctive and the most fascinating aspects of ancient Egyptian civilization is their unique and their beautiful system of writing, the hieroglyphs. For centuries, the hieroglyphs were a mystery to the world, a secret and a sacred script that no one could read. But the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 provided the key to deciphering the hieroglyphs, and it opened up a whole new world of knowledge about the history, the religion, and the literature of ancient Egypt. The language of the gods. The word hieroglyph comes from the Greek words hieros, meaning sacred, and glyph, meaning carving. The Egyptians themselves called their writing Medu Netjer, which means the words of the gods. They believed that writing was a gift from the god Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and of knowledge. The hieroglyphs were a sacred script, a script that was used for religious and for monumental purposes. They were carved on the walls of temples and of tombs, and they were written on papyrus scrolls. The hieroglyphic script is a complex and a beautiful system of writing, a system that is made up of hundreds of different signs. The signs can be divided into two main categories: logograms and phonograms. Logograms are signs that represent a whole word, while phonograms are signs that represent a sound. The hieroglyphic script is a combination of these two types of signs, and it can be read in a variety of different ways, from left to right, from right to left, or from top to bottom. The direction of the writing is indicated by the direction in which the human and the animal figures are facing. The scribes, the masters of the script. The ability to read and to write the hieroglyphic script was a rare and a valuable skill in ancient Egypt. The scribes were the educated elite of Egyptian society. the men who had mastered the complex and the difficult art of writing. They were a powerful and a respected class, and they held the highest positions in the government, the army, and the priesthood. The training of a scribe was a long and an arduous process, a process that could take up to 10 years. The young scribes would spend their days copying out texts and learning the hundreds of different signs of the hieroglyphic script. The Rosetta Stone, the key to decipherment. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the knowledge of how to read the hieroglyphs was lost. For more than 1,000 years, the hieroglyphs were a mystery, a secret and a sacred script that no one could understand. But in 1799, a group of French soldiers who were part of Napoleon Bonaparte's expedition to Egypt made a remarkable discovery. They found a large black stone slab in the town of Rosetta, a town in the Nile Delta. The stone was inscribed with a decree that had been issued by the pharaoh Ptolemy V in 196 BC. The decree was written in 3 different scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, a cursive form of the hieroglyphic script, and Greek. The Rosetta Stone was a major breakthrough because it provided a key to deciphering the hieroglyphs. The Greek text could be read, and it was assumed that the 3 texts were all translations of the same decree. A number of different scholars worked on the decipherment of the Rosetta Stone, but the man who is credited with the final and the definitive decipherment is the French scholar Jean-François Champollion. Champollion was a brilliant linguist, and he had a deep and a passionate interest in ancient Egypt. He spent years studying the Rosetta Stone, and in 1822, he finally succeeded in cracking the code. He realized that the hieroglyphic script was not just a collection of pictures, but a complex and a sophisticated system of writing that was a combination of logograms and of phonograms. A window into the past. The decipherment of the hieroglyphs was a momentous event. It opened up a whole new world of knowledge about ancient Egypt, a world that had been silent for more than 1,000 years. For the first time, it was possible to read the inscriptions on the temples and the tombs, to read the stories and the poems of the ancient Egyptians, to read their letters and their legal documents. The decipherment of the hieroglyphs was a key that unlocked the secrets of a great and a lost civilization, a key that allowed us to hear the voices of the ancient Egyptians and to understand their world in a way that had never been possible before. Part 11. Houses of the Gods. The Great Temples of Ancient Egypt. The landscape of ancient Egypt was dominated by the great and magnificent temples that were built to honor the gods. These temples were not just places of worship, they were the homes of the gods on earth, the sacred spaces where the human and the divine worlds intersected. They were also the centers of the Egyptian economy, vast and wealthy institutions that owned large tracts of land and that employed thousands of people. The great temples of ancient Egypt were a testament to the deep and the abiding faith of the Egyptian people. And they were a powerful and a visible symbol of the power and the wealth of the pharaohs. The temple as a model of the cosmos. The Egyptian temple was designed as a model of the cosmos, a microcosm of the universe. The temple was built on a sacred and a primordial mound, the mound that was believed to have emerged from the waters of chaos at the beginning of time. The temple was aligned with the east-west axis of the sun, and its various parts were designed to represent the different elements of the natural world. The floor of the temple was the earth, the roof was the sky, and the columns were the plants that grew from the earth. The temple was a place of great mystery and of great sanctity, a place that was accessible only to the priests and to the pharaoh. The common people were not allowed to enter the temple, and they could only participate in the worship of the gods during the great religious festivals. When the statues of the gods were carried out of the temples in great processions, the layout of the temple, a journey to the sacred. The typical Egyptian temple was laid out as a series of courts and of halls that led to the sanctuary, the most sacred part of the temple, where the statue of the god was kept. The journey through the temple was a journey from the profane to the sacred, a journey from the light to the darkness, a journey from the world of the living to the world of the gods. The entrance to the temple was marked by a massive pylon, a gateway that was decorated with scenes of the pharaoh smiting his enemies. The pylon was a symbol of the pharaoh's power and of his role as the defender of Egypt against the forces of chaos. Beyond the pylon was a large open court, which was surrounded by a colonnade and which was the only part of the temple that was accessible to the common people during the religious festivals. Beyond the open court was the hypostyle hall, a large and a dark hall that was filled with a forest of massive columns. The hypostyle hall was a place of great mystery and of great awe, a place that was designed to inspire a sense of reverence and of humility in the presence of the gods. The most famous and the most impressive of the hypostyle halls is the great hypostyle hall at the Temple of Karnak, which is one of the most magnificent and the most awe-inspiring architectural achievements of the ancient world. At the very back of the temple was the sanctuary, the most sacred and the most exclusive part of the temple. The sanctuary was a small and a dark room, where the statue of the god was kept in a sacred shrine. The statue of the god was not just a representation of the god, it was the god himself, the living embodiment of the divine. The daily life of the temple revolved around the care and the worship of the statue of the god. The priests would wake the god in the morning. They would wash him, they would dress him, and they would offer him food and drink. These daily rituals were a vital and a necessary part of the cosmic order, a way of ensuring the continued stability and the prosperity of the world. The great temples of Egypt, Karnak and Luxor. The most famous and the most impressive of the Egyptian temples are the great temples at Karnak and at Luxor, which are located in the modern-day city of Luxor, the ancient city of Thebes. The Temple of Karnak was the largest and the most important religious complex in ancient Egypt. A vast and a sprawling complex of temples, of chapels, and of pylons that was dedicated to the god Amun-Ra, the king of the gods. The Temple of Karnak was built and expanded over a period of more than 2,000 years, and it is a testament to the power and the wealth of the Theban priesthood. The Temple of Luxor was another great temple that was located in the city of Thebes, and it was connected to the Temple of Karnak by a long and a beautiful avenue of sphinxes. The Temple of Luxor was dedicated to the Theban triad of Amun-Ra, his wife Mut, and their son Khonsu. The Temple of Luxor was the site of the great Opet Festival, a magnificent celebration that was held every year, and that was one of the most important religious events of the Egyptian calendar. The great temples of ancient Egypt were more than just buildings. They were living and breathing institutions that were at the very heart of Egyptian civilization. They were a powerful and a visible symbol of the deep and the abiding faith of the Egyptian people, and they were a testament to the power, the wealth, and the ambition of the pharaohs who built them. Conclusion: a civilization that endures. And so, our long and winding journey down the Nile comes to an end. We have traveled through more than 3,000 years of history, from the dawn of civilization to the fall of the last pharaoh. We have witnessed the rise and the fall of great kingdoms, the construction of magnificent monuments, and the creation of a culture of extraordinary beauty, of profound wisdom, and of enduring power. The story of ancient Egypt is a story that has captivated and enchanted the world for centuries. And it is a story that continues to fascinate us, to inspire us, and to challenge us to this day. The legacy of ancient Egypt is a rich and a complex one. It is a legacy that can be seen in the great pyramids and the magnificent temples that still stand today as a testament to the skill, the ingenuity, and the ambition of the ancient Egyptians. It is a legacy that can be seen in the beautiful and the sophisticated art that they created, in the profound and the moving literature that they wrote, and in the deep and the abiding faith that they had in the power of the gods and in the promise of eternal life. But the legacy of ancient Egypt is more than just a collection of monuments and of artifacts. It is a legacy that is alive and well in the world today. The ancient Egyptians were pioneers in many fields of human endeavor, including mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. They were the first to develop a solar calendar, the first to use a system of writing, and the first to create a national government. The legacy of ancient Egypt is a legacy of innovation and of creativity, a legacy that has had a profound and a lasting impact on the course of human history. As you drift off to sleep, let the memory of ancient Egypt linger in your mind. Let it be a reminder that the great civilizations of the past were not just collections of buildings and of artifacts, but living and breathing societies. Societies that were filled with people who loved and who feared, who dreamed and who despaired, who lived and who died. Let it be a reminder that the past is never truly past, that the echoes of a great and a lost civilization can still be heard in the world today. And let it be a reminder that the human spirit is a resilient and an enduring one. The civilization of ancient Egypt faced many challenges, from foreign invasion to internal strife, from famine to disease, but it always managed to survive, to adapt, and to create a culture of extraordinary beauty and of profound wisdom. The story of ancient Egypt is a story of the triumph of the human spirit, a story of the power of hope, of faith, and of creativity to overcome even the greatest of challenges. Sleep well, dear listener, and may the dreams that visit you in the night be filled with the wonder and the mystery of a civilization that was as timeless as the river that gave it life. Part 12. The Amarna Heresy, Akhenaten and the Sun God. In the long and largely consistent history of ancient Egyptian religion, there was one brief, revolutionary, and utterly transformative period that stands out like a bolt of lightning in a clear sky. This was the Amarna period, a short but intense era during the New Kingdom when the pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who would rename himself Akhenaten, overthrew the entire pantheon of traditional gods and replaced them with the worship of a single universal deity, the Aten, the physical disk of the sun. This religious revolution, one of the first experiments in monotheism in human history, was accompanied by a radical shift in art, in architecture, and in the very fabric of Egyptian society. It was a heresy, a glorious and a failed experiment that would be violently suppressed, its memory erased, and its king condemned as a heretic for millennia. The rise of the sun god. The groundwork for Akhenaten's revolution was laid in the reigns of his predecessors. The sun god Ra had always been a primary deity, but during the New Kingdom, the god Amun of Thebes had been merged with him to create the supreme state god, Amun-Ra. The priesthood of Amun-Ra had grown immensely powerful and wealthy, controlling vast estates and rivaling the pharaoh himself in influence. The young Amenhotep IV, who came to the throne around 1353 BC, seems to have been a man of deep and unconventional religious conviction, and he may have seen the established priesthood as a corrupt and a stagnant force that stood in the way of true piety. In the early years of his reign, Amenhotep IV began to promote the worship of the Aten, a previously minor aspect of the sun god. The Aten was not depicted in human or animal form, but as a simple solar disk, its rays extending down to the earth, each ray ending in a small hand that offered the Ankh, the symbol of life, to the king and his family. For Akhenaten, the Aten was the universal creator, the source of all life, not just in Egypt, but throughout the world. He was the one and only God, a God of light, of love, and of truth. The Great Heresy, a new religion. In the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV took a radical and an unprecedented step. He changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. He abandoned the great city of Thebes, the traditional religious capital, and the center of the Amun-Ra cult, and he built a new capital city from scratch in the desert of Middle Egypt. He called this city Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, modern-day Amarna. This was to be a holy city, a place dedicated solely to the worship of the one true God. Akhenaten then launched a full-scale attack on the old religion. He closed the temples of Amun-Ra and of the other gods. He confiscated their revenues, and he dispatched workers across the land to chisel out the name of Amun and the plural word for gods from monuments and from inscriptions. This was a direct and a brutal assault on the very foundations of Egyptian culture and of Egyptian identity. The king and his beautiful wife, Nefertiti, became the sole intermediaries between the Aten and humanity. Only through them could the god be known and worshipped. The traditional relationship between the people and their gods was severed, replaced by a new and a more distant relationship that was mediated by the royal family. The Amarna art, a revolution in style. The religious revolution was accompanied by a revolution in art. The formal, idealized, and timeless style of traditional Egyptian art was replaced by a new and a startlingly different style. The art of the Amarna period is characterized by its naturalism, its emotionalism, and its often unflattering realism. Akhenaten himself was depicted with a strange and an elongated skull, a long and slender neck, a potbelly, and wide hips. This has led to much speculation about whether he suffered from some kind of genetic disorder or whether this was a deliberate artistic choice, a way of depicting the king as a unique and a divine being who was both male and female, the earthly embodiment of the universal creator God. The art of the Amarna period also depicts scenes of unprecedented intimacy and of affection within the royal family. We see Akhenaten and Nefertiti playing with their daughters, kissing them, and mourning the death of one of them. These are images of a loving and a human family, a far cry from the remote and the godlike images of the traditional pharaohs. The fall of the heretic King Akhenaten's revolution was a top-down affair, imposed on the people by the will of the king. It was not a popular movement, and it was deeply resented by the displaced priests and by the common people who were attached to their traditional gods and to their traditional ways of life. Akhenaten also seems to have neglected the affairs of state, and the Egyptian empire in the Near East began to crumble. His reign was a time of internal turmoil and of external decline. Akhenaten ruled for 17 years, and after his death, his religious revolution quickly collapsed. He was succeeded by a series of short-lived and ephemeral rulers, including the famous boy king Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun, whose original name was Tutankhaten, abandoned the worship of the Aten. He restored the old gods and he moved the capital back to Thebes. The city of Akhetaten was abandoned to the desert, and the name of Akhenaten was erased from the historical records. He was remembered only as the heretic, or the enemy. The Amarna period was a brief and a brilliant interlude in the long history of ancient Egypt. It was a time of great creativity and of great innovation, a time when a single individual dared to challenge the traditions of 1,000 years and to imagine a new and a different world. It was a revolution that failed, but it was a revolution that left a deep and a lasting mark on the history of human thought. A tantalizing glimpse of a different kind of religion, a different kind of art, and a different kind of king. Part 13. The Boy King. Tutankhamun and the discovery of his tomb. Among all the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, none has captured the modern imagination more than Tutankhamun, the boy king who ruled for only 9 years and who died at the age of 18. Tutankhamun is famous not for his achievements as a ruler, but for the extraordinary discovery of his tomb in the Valley of the Kings in 1922. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was one of the most significant archaeological events of the 20th century, and it provided an unprecedented glimpse into the world of the ancient Egyptians. The boy who became a king, Tutankhamun, was born around 1341 BC, during the reign of his father Akhenaten. His original name was Tutankhaten, and he was the son of Akhenaten and one of his wives. When Akhenaten died, Tutankhamun was only about 9 years old. He was married to his half-sister Ankhesenamun, as was the custom among the royal family, and he was crowned as the pharaoh of Egypt. Tutankhamun was a weak and a sickly child, and he was completely under the control of the powerful officials of the court, particularly the vizier, and the commander of the army, Horemheb. These men used the young king as a puppet to consolidate their own power. One of the first things that Tutankhamun did was to abandon the worship of the Aten and to restore the worship of the old gods, particularly Amun-Ra. He also moved the capital back to Thebes and restored the power and the wealth of the priesthood of Amun-Ra. In many ways, Tutankhamun's reign was a restoration of the traditional order, a reversal of the revolutionary changes that his father, Akhenaten, had introduced. Tutankhamun ruled for only 9 years. In the 9th year of his reign, he died suddenly at the age of 18. The cause of his death is not entirely clear. Some scholars believe that he died of a genetic disease, the result of the intermarriage between members of the royal family. Others believe that he was murdered, possibly by the vizier, or by the commander of the army, Horemheb, who both had a great deal to gain from his death. But whatever the cause of his death, Tutankhamun was buried in a small and a modest tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a tomb that would remain hidden and undisturbed for more than 3,000 years. The discovery, a window into the past. In 1922, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter was excavating in the Valley of the Kings, searching for the tombs of the pharaohs. On the 4th of November 1922, one of his workers discovered a stone step leading down into the earth. Carter and his team began to excavate, and they discovered a series of steps leading down to a sealed door. Behind the door was a passage, and beyond the passage was an antechamber filled with treasures. Carter had discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun, one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of all time. The tomb of Tutankhamun was filled with an extraordinary array of treasures: golden statues, golden chariots, golden furniture, golden jewelry, and thousands of other objects. The walls of the tomb were decorated with beautiful and intricate paintings that depicted scenes from the life of the young king and from the afterlife. At the very center of the tomb was the burial chamber, where the mummified body of Tutankhamun lay in a series of nested coffins, the innermost of which was made of solid gold. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was a sensation. It captured the imagination of the world, and it led to a renewed interest in ancient Egypt. The treasures from the tomb were carefully excavated and were studied by scholars, and they provided an unprecedented glimpse into the world of the ancient Egyptians. The tomb of Tutankhamun is the most complete royal tomb that has ever been discovered, and it is a testament to the skill, the artistry, and the wealth of the ancient Egyptians. The Curse of the Pharaoh, Myth and Reality. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was accompanied by a great deal of sensationalism and of speculation. Newspapers around the world reported that the tomb was cursed, and that anyone who entered the tomb would be struck down by the curse of the pharaoh. Several members of Howard Carter's team died in the years following the discovery, and the popular press attributed their deaths to the curse. In reality, most of the deaths were from natural causes, and there is no evidence of any supernatural curse. But the myth of the curse of the pharaoh has persisted to this day, and it has become a part of the popular culture surrounding ancient Egypt. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was a turning point in the history of archaeology. It demonstrated the importance of careful and scientific excavation, and it showed that even a relatively minor pharaoh could have a tomb filled with extraordinary treasures. The tomb of Tutankhamun is a window into the world of the ancient Egyptians, a window that allows us to see, to touch, and to understand the life and the death of a civilization that flourished more than 3,000 years ago. Part 14. The Women of Egypt. Power, Influence, and Independence. While the history of ancient Egypt is often told as the story of great kings and of great pharaohs, it is also a story in which women played a crucial and an often overlooked role. The women of ancient Egypt enjoyed a degree of independence, of legal rights, and of social status that was unusual for the ancient world. They could own property, they could run businesses, they could divorce their husbands, and they could even become pharaohs. The story of the women of ancient Egypt is a story of power, of influence, and of a remarkable degree of independence. The legal rights of women. The legal status of women in ancient Egypt was remarkably progressive for the time. Women had the right to own property, to buy and to sell land, to make contracts, and to conduct business. They had the right to inherit property from their husbands and from their fathers, and they had the right to bequeath their property to their children. They had the right to divorce their husbands, and if they did, they were entitled to a share of the marital property. They could also testify in court, and they could bring legal cases against other people. These legal rights were not just theoretical, they were enforced by the courts, and there are many examples of women who used these rights to protect their interests and to advance their position in society. Women could be scribes, they could be merchants, they could be priestesses, and they could be landowners. Some women became very wealthy and very powerful through their own efforts and through their own abilities. The great queens, Hatshepsut and Nefertiti. The most famous and the most powerful of the women of ancient Egypt were those who became pharaohs, or who were the wives of pharaohs. The most famous of these was Hatshepsut, who ruled as a pharaoh for more than 20 years. Hatshepsut was a woman of great ambition and of great ability, and she was one of the most successful rulers in Egyptian history. She was a great builder, and she was responsible for the construction of some of the most magnificent and the most beautiful monuments of the New Kingdom, including her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. Another famous queen was Nefertiti, the wife of Akhenaten. Nefertiti was a woman of great beauty and of great intelligence, and she played an important role in the religious revolution of her husband. She was depicted in art as the equal of the pharaoh, and she participated in the worship of the Aten alongside her husband. After the death of Akhenaten, Nefertiti seems to have ruled as a regent for a brief period, and she may have even ruled as a pharaoh in her own right. Although this is a matter of some scholarly debate, the role of women in the family and in society. For the vast majority of women in ancient Egypt, life was centered on the family. Women were expected to be good wives and good mothers, and they were responsible for the management of the household. But this did not mean that they were powerless or that they were without influence. The household was an important economic unit, and the woman of the house was responsible for managing the servants, for overseeing the production of food and of clothing, and for raising and educating the children. Women had a great deal of influence over their husbands and over their children, and they were respected and honored for their role in the family. Women also participated in the religious life of the community. They could be priestesses, and they could participate in the worship of the gods. Some women became famous for their piety and for their devotion to the gods. Women also played an important role in the funerary rituals and in the worship of the dead. They were the ones who performed the mourning rituals, and they were the ones who made the offerings to the deceased. The exceptional women, Cleopatra and others. Some women rose to positions of great power and of great influence. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, was a woman of great intelligence, of great ambition, and of great charm. She was a skilled politician and a shrewd diplomat, and she was determined to preserve the independence of her kingdom in a world that was increasingly dominated by the growing power of Rome. She formed alliances with two of the most powerful men in Rome, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and she bore children to both of them. She was a woman who used her intelligence, her charm, and her political skills to advance her own interests and the interests of her kingdom. The women of ancient Egypt were not just passive observers of history. They were active participants in the life of their civilization. They were mothers and wives. They were priestesses and priestesses. They were merchants and landowners, and some of them were pharaohs. They had legal rights, they had economic power, and they had social influence. The story of the women of ancient Egypt is a story of a civilization that, in many ways, was ahead of its time in its recognition of the rights and the capabilities of women. Part 15. The Lifeblood of Egypt, the Nile River and its Cycles. The Nile River was not just a geographical feature of ancient Egypt. It was the very foundation of Egyptian civilization, the source of all life, the provider of all abundance. Without the Nile, there would have been no Egypt, no pyramids, no pharaohs, and no civilization. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile, and this phrase captures the essential truth about the relationship between the Egyptians and their great river. The Nile was the center of Egyptian life, the axis around which all of Egyptian culture, religion, and society revolved. The geography of the Nile, a river in the desert. The Nile River is the longest river in the world, stretching for more than 4,100 miles from its source in the highlands of East Africa to its mouth in the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile flows through a vast and arid desert, and it is the only source of water and of life in this inhospitable landscape. The Nile Valley is a long and narrow strip of fertile land, a ribbon of green that winds through the desert like a precious jewel. The Nile Delta, at the mouth of the river, is a vast and fertile plain that is crisscrossed by a network of canals and of waterways. The Nile was not always a river of abundance. In ancient times, the Nile was a wild and an unpredictable river, a river that was subject to dramatic fluctuations in water level. The annual inundation of the Nile was the most important event of the Egyptian year, an event that was crucial to the survival of the civilization. The inundation brought water and fertile silt to the fields, and it was the foundation of Egyptian agriculture. The annual inundation, the rhythm of life. The annual inundation of the Nile was a phenomenon that was caused by the heavy rains that fell in the highlands of East Africa. These rains caused the Nile to swell, and the swollen river would overflow its banks and inundate the surrounding land. The inundation would last for several months, from June to September, and it would deposit a thick layer of fertile silt on the fields. This silt was rich in nutrients, and it was the foundation of Egyptian agriculture. The Egyptians divided the year into 3 seasons, each of which was defined by the state of the Nile. The first season was Akhet, the inundation, which lasted from June to September. During this season, the Nile would overflow its banks and the fields would be flooded. The second season was Peret, the growing season, which lasted from September to March. During this season, the farmers would plant their crops, and the crops would grow in the fertile soil that had been deposited by the inundation. The third season was Shemu, the harvest, which lasted from March to June. During this season, the farmers would harvest their crops, and they would prepare for the next inundation. The annual cycle of the Nile was so important to the Egyptians that it became the basis of their calendar. The Egyptian year was divided into 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 extra days at the end of the year. The year began on the day of the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, which coincided with the beginning of the inundation. The Nilometer, measuring the inundation. The level of the Nile was a matter of great importance to the Egyptians. If the inundation was too low, the fields would not receive enough water and fertile silt, and there would be a poor harvest and a famine. If the inundation was too high, the fields would be flooded too deeply, and the crops would be destroyed. The Egyptians developed a device called a nilometer to measure the level of the Nile. The nilometer was a simple structure that consisted of a well or a channel that was connected to the Nile, with a scale marked on the walls to measure the level of the water. The nilometer was not just a practical device. It was also a sacred and a symbolic object. The level of the Nile was recorded by the priests, and the records were kept in the temples. The level of the Nile was used to determine the amount of taxes that would be collected from the people. If the inundation was good, the taxes would be lower because the people would have a good harvest and would be able to pay their taxes. If the inundation was poor, the taxes would be higher because the people would need to pay more to support the state. The Nile and Egyptian religion. The Nile was not just a physical reality. It was also a spiritual and a religious reality. The Egyptians worshiped the Nile as a god, the god Hapi, the god of the inundation. Hapi was depicted as a man with a large belly and with breasts, a symbol of fertility and of abundance. The Egyptians believed that Hapi was responsible for the annual inundation, and they offered prayers and sacrifices to him to ensure that the inundation would be abundant and that the crops would grow. The Nile was also connected to the god Osiris, the god of the underworld and of the afterlife. The annual inundation was seen as a kind of death and rebirth, a cycle of destruction and of renewal. The fields were flooded and were seemingly destroyed, but they were then renewed and were made fertile by the silt that was deposited by the inundation. This cycle of death and rebirth was seen as a reflection of the cycle of human life and of the promise of the afterlife. The Nile as a highway, trade and communication. The Nile was not just a source of water and of fertile land. It was also a highway, a means of transportation and of communication. The Egyptians built boats to travel on the Nile, and they used these boats to transport goods, to trade with other peoples, and to move troops and supplies. The Nile was the main road of Egypt, and it was the means by which the different regions of the country were connected to each other. The Nile was also a means of communication with the outside world. The Egyptians traded with the peoples of the Mediterranean, with the peoples of the Near East, and with the peoples of Africa. The Nile was the gateway to the world, and it was the means by which Egypt was connected to the wider world. The Nile River was the foundation of Egyptian civilization, the source of all life, the provider of all abundance. It was the center of Egyptian life, the axis around which all of Egyptian culture, religion, and society revolved. Without the Nile, there would have been no Egypt, and without Egypt, the world would have been a very different place. Part 16. The Warriors of Egypt. Warfare, Weapons, and the Military. While ancient Egypt is often remembered as a civilization of peace and of stability, it was also a civilization that was capable of great military power and of great military achievement. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom, in particular, were great warrior kings who built a vast and a powerful empire through military conquest. The Egyptian military was a well-organized and a well-equipped force, and it was one of the most powerful armies of the ancient world. The organization of the Egyptian military. The Egyptian military was organized into a hierarchical structure, with the pharaoh as the supreme commander. The military was divided into several branches, including the infantry, the chariotry, and the navy. The infantry was the backbone of the Egyptian army, and it was made up of conscripted soldiers from all over Egypt. The chariotry was the elite of the Egyptian military, and it was made up of the sons of the nobility and of the wealthy. The chariots were drawn by horses, which had been introduced to Egypt by the Hyksos, and they were equipped with archers who could rain arrows down on the enemy from a distance. The Egyptian military also had a navy, which was used to patrol the Nile and to protect Egypt's maritime interests. The Egyptian ships were made of wood, and they were equipped with sails and with oars. The navy was used to transport troops, to supply the army, and to protect Egypt's trade routes. Weapons and tactics. The Egyptians used a variety of different weapons in warfare. The primary weapon of the Egyptian infantry was the spear, which was used for both thrusting and throwing. The Egyptians also used bows and arrows, which were very effective in warfare. The composite bow, which was made of wood, horn, and sinew, was a powerful and an accurate weapon. The Egyptians also used axes, swords, and daggers for close combat. The Egyptians also used a variety of defensive equipment, including shields, helmets, and body armor. The shields were made of wood and leather, and they were often decorated with intricate designs. The helmets were made of leather or of bronze, and they provided protection for the head and the neck. The body armor was made of leather or of bronze, and it provided protection for the torso. The Egyptian military tactics were based on the use of the chariotry to break the enemy lines, followed by the infantry to mop up the remaining enemy forces. The archers would provide covering fire, and the infantry would advance in a coordinated and disciplined manner. The Egyptians were masters of siege warfare, and they used a variety of different siege weapons, including battering rams and siege towers, to break down the walls of enemy fortifications. The great military campaigns. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom launched a series of great military campaigns that expanded the borders of Egypt, and that created a vast and a powerful empire. One of the most famous of these campaigns was the campaign of Thutmose III against the kingdom of Mitanni. Thutmose III was one of the greatest military leaders in Egyptian history, and he is often called the Napoleon of Egypt. He launched a series of campaigns that took him as far as the Euphrates River, and he created an empire that stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. Another famous military campaign was the campaign of Ramesses II against the Hittites. Ramesses II was a great warrior, and he fought a series of wars against the Hittites, the other great power of the Near East. The most famous of these wars was the Battle of Kadesh, which took place in 1274 BC. The Battle of Kadesh was one of the largest chariot battles in history, and it was fought between the armies of Ramesses II and the Hittite king Muwatalli. The battle was a stalemate, and it was followed by a peace treaty, the world's first recorded peace treaty, which was signed between Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III. The decline of Egyptian military power. The military power of Egypt began to decline in the later periods of Egyptian history. The Third Intermediate Period saw the rise of new powers in the Near East, including the Assyrians and the Persians, who were more powerful and more militarily advanced than Egypt. By the time of the Late Period, Egypt was no longer a great military power, and it was conquered by a series of foreign powers, including the Persians and the Greeks. The Egyptian military was a powerful and an effective force, and it was one of the main reasons for the success and the longevity of Egyptian civilization. The military campaigns of the pharaohs expanded the borders of Egypt and created a vast and a powerful empire. The military organization and the military tactics of the Egyptians were advanced for their time, and they were a testament to the skill, the organization, and the discipline of the ancient Egyptians. Part 17. The Merchants of Egypt: Trade, Commerce, and Economic Life. While agriculture was the foundation of the Egyptian economy, trade and commerce also played an important role in the economic life of ancient Egypt. The Egyptians were skilled traders and merchants, and they traded with peoples from all over the known world. They traded for goods that were not available in Egypt, such as cedar wood from Lebanon, incense from the land of Punt, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. In return, they exported goods that were produced in Egypt, such as grain, linen, and papyrus. The trade routes. Connecting the ancient world. The Egyptians had established a series of trade routes that connected Egypt to the rest of the known world. The most important of these was the trade route to the land of Punt, a mysterious and a distant land that is believed to have been located in the Horn of Africa, in the region of modern-day Somalia or Eritrea. The land of Punt was famous for its production of incense, particularly frankincense and myrrh, which were highly valued in Egypt for use in religious ceremonies and for use in cosmetics. Another important trade route was the route to the Levant, the region of the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Egyptians traded with the peoples of the Levant, particularly the Phoenicians, who were skilled sailors and merchants. The Egyptians imported cedar wood from Lebanon, which was used in the construction of ships and of temples. They also imported copper from Cyprus, which was used to make tools and weapons. The Egyptians also had trade routes that extended to the south, into the land of Nubia and beyond. They traded for gold, which was mined in Nubia and which was highly valued in Egypt. They also traded for ivory, ebony, and other exotic goods that came from the interior of Africa. The merchants and the trading companies. The merchants of ancient Egypt were organized into trading companies, which were often controlled by the state or by the temples. The The most important of these trading companies were those that were controlled by the pharaoh and by the temples of the gods. These trading companies sent out expeditions to distant lands, and they brought back valuable goods that were used by the state and by the temples. The merchants of ancient Egypt were skilled negotiators and diplomats, and they often served as ambassadors to foreign lands. They were responsible for maintaining the trade relationships between Egypt and the other peoples of the ancient world. They also served as sources of information about foreign lands, and they provided the pharaoh with intelligence about the political and the military situation in distant regions. The markets and the bazaars. The goods that were traded by the merchants of ancient Egypt were bought and sold in the markets and the bazaars of the cities and towns of Egypt. The markets were important centers of economic activity, and they were also important centers of social life. The markets were places where people from all walks of life came together to buy and to sell goods, to exchange news and information, and to socialize with their friends and their neighbors. The markets were often located near the temples or near the palaces of the local officials, and they were usually regulated by the state. The state would collect taxes on the goods that were sold in the markets, and it would also enforce standards of weights and measures to ensure that the merchants were not cheating their customers. The barter system and the use of money. The ancient Egyptians did not use money in the way that we use it today. Instead, they used a barter system in which goods were exchanged for other goods. However, there was a standard unit of value that was used to facilitate trade, the deben, which was a unit of weight that was used to measure the value of goods. The deben was not a coin or a piece of currency, but a unit of account that was used to determine the value of goods and to facilitate the exchange of goods. Later in Egyptian history, particularly during the late period, the Egyptians began to use coins as a medium of exchange. The coins were made of silver or of gold, and they were stamped with the image of the pharaoh or with the symbol of the state. The use of coins made trade easier and more efficient, and it facilitated the development of a more complex and a more sophisticated economy. The economic impact of trade. Trade had a profound impact on the economic and the political life of ancient Egypt. The wealth that was generated by trade allowed the pharaohs to build the great temples and the great monuments that are still standing today. The trade relationships that were established with foreign lands also had a profound impact on the political and the military situation in the ancient world. The control of trade routes was a source of power and of wealth, and it was one of the main reasons for the military campaigns and the political alliances that were formed by the pharaohs. The merchants of ancient Egypt were the engines of economic growth and of cultural exchange. They brought new goods, new ideas, and new technologies to Egypt, and they helped to integrate Egypt into the wider world of the ancient Mediterranean and the ancient Near East. The trade networks that they established were the foundation of the economic prosperity of ancient Egypt, and they were a key factor in the longevity and the success of Egyptian civilization.